Hi and welcome back to the Silverstone Museum YouTube channel. If you're liking the content and enjoying what we're doing recently, then grab us a like, grab a subscribe, and more importantly, ask us any questions and interact with us. We love hearing from you. Today, we're going to follow on with our Indy cars. Last week, we looked a little bit at that lovely Lola T93, but today we're going way back to 1922, and we're going to look at this Bentley. Bentley is that evocative name that's been so important in motorsport, particularly at tracks like Le Mans, where they really made their name. However, little known fact that Bentley actually raced at the Indy 500. They only did it once in 1922, and this is the car that raced it. Now, we've brought it over as part of our link with the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum in America, and it's absolutely stunning. It's the oldest car we've had here at the museum. It was made in 1922, and there were only 4 of these cars made in the UK. This one was developed and made changes to go and race at the Indy 500. W.D. Hawkes was the driver, and he decided to ship the car over, and legend goes that he drove it from the port to Indianapolis to race. A number of different modifications, a number of things I'd like to point out to you because there's some lovely detail in the car. Firstly, looking at this huge exhaust that sits at the side of the car. We'll take the camera inside in a moment, but could you imagine being a passenger in this vehicle and sitting next to this huge exhaust? If we look just down at the tyres, these tyres may look very, very simple, but they were actually changed. They were made for a much more kind of US market. So these high-sided tyres were put on because they knew they were likely to have some problems in the US. They were going to need to change the tyres, so they changed them to ones that were likely to be available in America. Also got these old-fashioned hubs on here where you knock off the wheel with the hammer. It really goes back to that old style of motoring, and it's absolutely lovely. The detail's lovely. Looking at the wood that we base the engine on top of the chassis on here, it's finished beautifully. As I say, this was originally designed as a touring car, but was made for racing at the Indy 500. And I'll show you a couple of the other modifications. If we just bring the camera around here, firstly, we can't go anywhere without looking at these old 1920s cars without these crank handles. These were actually quite vicious, but you turn the handle to start the engine. But they did have a bit of a kick, and it was quite common for people to break wrists and injuries. No, I didn't do this by turning that crank handle, by the way. If we move around the car here, I'm just going to get the camera to have a quick look inside the cockpit, because there's a couple of features in this car which are absolutely lovely. The leather seats. I mean, could you imagine racing today with leather seats? And I love the fact they've got the little pops in and everything. The steering wheel itself is actually quite large, but this was a modification that was put in place for racing at the Indy 500. You were only allowed steel steering wheels. At the time, Bentley were making those in the UK out of aluminium, so this had to be changed. We've got this huge dial here which really dominates the dash, and this is not only a rev counter but also a speedo as well, and if we get the camera in you can see that. We've got other little switches here for the magnetos, and then we've got a number of pressure gauges and a traditional choke. Another part of the regulation was to have the gear stick and the gear handle on the outside of the car, so that's why that sits out here. And rather frighteningly, you've got the fuel lines that run on the outside of the car, certainly something that we don't see today. The fuel tank and the rear shape of the car is really designed for racing at Indy. The fuel tank is kind of almost an aero shape, quite a small fuel tank actually. And when the drivers would come into the pits, it was a quick fuel step. We'd take this off and we'd fit it on the car, fit the fuel in there. The car was designed, as I say, to race at Indy, and it had a couple of other things added for racing. We've modified the suspension here with the shackles to make sure the suspension didn't pop too far open and keep it nice and tight for racing on the track. Now, The car raced at Indy, and I haven't talked about results, and I haven't talked about results for a reason. It certainly didn't win the race. It was competing against cars that were purpose-built racing cars. Any of the cars under 2 litre were able to only have 1 seat in the car, whereas this one had to have 2, as you've already seen. That was a huge advantage for the 2 litre cars. Also, a lot of the cars were purpose-built for racing. This one was a converted touring car and actually used on the road. And the car finished a lowly 13th, but it did average speed of nearly 75 miles an hour. Now, I couldn't imagine going 75 miles an hour in a car like this, what that would feel like, how bumpy it would be, especially bearing in mind the circuit at Indy back in 1922 was paved with individual bricks, hundreds of thousands of them. So with this suspension that would have bounced up and down, this steering wheel to hold on to, a huge car, this would have been quite a bumpy ride in the Indy 500.